The air was a stale breath, thick with the phantom tang of ozone and something metallic, something like fear. I drifted, a ghost in a dim hospital hallway with no staff, machines quietly breathing. The rhythmic sigh and whir of unseen mechanisms whispered a lullaby of dread, each pulse a slow, deliberate drumbeat against the silence. My own breath hitched, a shallow, desperate thing, yet I could not remember how I came to this place, nor why the cold, sterile light felt like a shroud. The walls, a muted institutional green, seemed to press in, blurring at the edges of my vision. A profound disorientation, like a compass spinning wildly in a magnetic storm, seized me. Then, the haze lifted, or perhaps it merely shifted, and I was elsewhere. I stood, blinking, in the cavernous study of Blackwood Manor, my ancestral burden. The weight of the place settled upon me like a physical mantle, heavy with generations of neglect and forgotten tales. For years, my life had been a series of precise lines and carefully rendered contours, a world of established boundaries and verifiable facts. I was Reid, a cartographer whose professional obsession lay in the meticulous transcription of the Earth's surface, translating its vast, chaotic beauty into ordered, legible truths. Every elevation, every riverine meander, every forgotten hamlet held its rightful place under my steady hand. My maps were not merely depictions, they were testaments to accuracy, to the relentless pursuit of objective reality. But Blackwood Manor, bequeathed to me by a distant, almost spectral relative, was a challenge to everything I understood. The estate itself was a monument to decay, gables sagged, slate tiles had slipped like broken teeth, and ivy, thick as a wrestler's arm, had begun its slow, inexorable reclamation of the stone. My primary task, or so I told myself, was to catalog the family's forgotten archives, a task I approached with the same methodical rigor I applied to my cartographic work. Days blurred into a rhythm of careful sorting and dusting, the air thick with the scent of aged parchment and forgotten things. It was within a colossal, iron-bound steamer trunk in the furthest corner of the study, a trunk that groaned in protest as I forced its reluctant hinges, that I found it. Beneath layers of moth-eaten velvets and brittle lace, nestled among tarnished daguerreotypes of stern, unsmiling faces, lay a rolled parchment, tied with a fraying leather thong. My fingers, usually so sure and steady, trembled slightly as I untied the knot. The parchment unrolled with a crackle like dry autumn leaves, revealing a map. Not just a map, but the map of Blackwood Manor, or so it purported to be. It was undeniably ancient, the vellum yellowed and brittle, its edges softened by time. The ink, however, retained an astonishing depth, a rich, almost living black that seemed to absorb the light. My professional eye immediately recognized the masterful hand behind its creation. The topographical details were rendered with an almost obsessive precision, the subtle undulations of the surrounding hills, the precise curve of the creek, even individual stands of ancient oaks were depicted with an accuracy that transcended mere representation. Yet, it was the anomalies that truly snagged my attention, pulling me closer, forcing my breath to shallow. The map was incomplete. Not merely unfinished, but truncated. And within its meticulously drawn boundaries, strange symbols proliferated. They were not the familiar icons of geology or land use. These were intricate, almost organic designs, coiling lines and angular geometries that seemed to writhe on the page. Some resembled stylized roots, others arcane glyphs, each one placed with deliberate intent, hinting at features far beneath the Earth's surface, or perhaps, within its very spirit. A shiver, unrelated to the draft from the broken window, traced its way down my spine. The map was a puzzle, an invitation, but it felt wrong. My professional curiosity, a force as strong and precise as any tide, surged within me, overriding the nascent unease. This was a cartographic enigma, a challenge to my very craft. I had to complete it. The manor's true story, I suspected, was etched not on its decaying walls, but within the unsettling contours of this incomplete, malevolent drawing. But then the metallic tang shifted, softened, replaced by the deep, earthy scent of damp plaster and aged timber. The machines dissolved into the distant creak of old floorboards, the sighing into the wind that worried the eaves. My eyes, heavy with sleep and the lingering phantom of that sterile, oppressive place, fluttered open. I was not in a hallway. I was in my own bed, within the ancestral estate, the morning light a pale wash through the grimy panes of the bedroom window. I pushed myself upright, the mattress groaning beneath my weight, the old spring singing a rusty tune. It called to me, a silent challenge. My cartographer's soul, meticulous and precise, yearned to reconcile its intricate lines with the physical world outside. The unsettling details, the incomplete sections, they were anomalies begging for resolution. The estate grounds were a testament to decades of neglect. What had once been manicured lawns and ordered gardens were now a tangled wilderness of thorny bushes and trees grown wild, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and brittle twigs as I moved, the air cool and damp, carrying the scent of rich soil and decay. I unfolded the map, holding it against the weak sunlight, tracing the familiar lines of the main house and the known outbuildings. Then, I began to walk. My first objective was the perimeter, to establish the known boundaries and then venture inward. The modern deeds, carefully filed away in a dusty box back inside, spoke of a certain acreage, clear and defined. But as I pushed through a thicket of overgrown rhododendrons, a crumbling wall of rough-hewn stone emerged, choked with ivy and moss. It was too substantial to be a garden folly, too extensive to be a mere property divider. It didn't appear on the current survey, nor on any of the more recent, less detailed family charts. The map, however, had a faint, almost erased line, here, marked with a tiny, indecipherable symbol. My brow furrowed. This was an unrecorded structure, a ghost of an edifice swallowed by time and foliage. What could it have been? A forgotten stable? A protective barrier for something deeper within? Further on, as I navigated a particularly dense copse of ancient oaks, I noticed it. Not a structure, but an absence of light. The map showed only woodland here, no specific feature to explain such a peculiar phenomenon. Yet this felt different, heavy, and watchful. My exploration led me to the edge of what the modern deeds vaguely referred to as the North Field, now a meadow of waist-high grasses swaying in the breeze. They weren't gravestones, nor were they property stakes. Their surfaces were pitted and worn, their edges softened by centuries of weather, but I could discern faint, shallow etchings on a few shapes that defied recognition, neither letters nor symbols I had ever encountered in my extensive study of historical iconography. The map, in this precise location, bore a curious, radiating pattern, a starburst of delicate lines that seemed to emanate from a central point. There was no corresponding symbol for the stones themselves, only the pattern. What did they mark? What ancient purpose did they serve? As I knelt, tracing the eroded lines on one of the stones with a gloved finger, a sound drifted on the wind. It sounded like something being dragged, slowly, deliberately, just beyond the thick veil of the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, straining to hear it again. The breeze picked up, rustling the tall grasses, and the sound was lost. Had it been merely the wind playing tricks? The methodical certainty that usually grounded me, the quiet confidence of a man who dealt in facts and verifiable measurements, began to fray. The discrepancies were not minor inaccuracies, they were gaping holes in the known reality of this place. They were anomalies, demanding not just a place on a map, but an explanation that felt increasingly beyond the realm of the rational. Then, a sudden, jarring snap, a rupture in that sterile quiet, and I was clawing my way back through layers of sleep, the dream hallway dissolving into the familiar, heavy darkness of my bedroom. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the rough wool of the rug a grounding sensation beneath my bare feet. The following days began to blur, each one a slow descent into a subtle disquiet. I found myself pausing, head cocked, listening for sounds that weren't there. It was the old house, I reasoned, the way the ancient timbers shifted, the way the waning light caught dust motes and made them dance like specters. My eyes, perhaps, were playing tricks on me, strained from hours of meticulous cartography. Yet, the phenomena persisted, gaining a quiet insistence. Faint, breathy currents that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, like dry leaves skittering across stone, or the rustle of forgotten silk. I would stop my work, straining to catch a syllable, a meaning, but they would always recede, leaving me with only the sound of my own quickened pulse. The house was settling, I'd tell myself, the wind finding its way through unseen cracks, creating these phantom voices. A house this old, this remote, would naturally have its own peculiar acoustics. Then came the small, unsettling shifts. My drafting compass, left precisely beside the inkwell, would be found an inch or two to the left, its brass gleaming innocently. A book of local folklore, which I'd placed on the lowest shelf, would appear on the mantelpiece, its cover slightly ajar. I initially dismissed these as my own absent-mindedness, a sign of my increasing fatigue. I was alone, after all, there was no one else to move them. But the pattern began to prick at my composure, a tiny, insistent thorn. I started to take mental notes, placing objects with deliberate precision, only to find them subtly displaced hours later. The rationalizations, once so comforting, began to feel like thin veils, easily torn. The nights offered no reprieve. I could feel the roots of ancient trees snaking around my limbs, feel the slow, inexorable pull of something deep beneath the earth, something that called to me with a silent, primal hunger. I picked up my fine-tipped pen, intending to add a detail I just verified from an old land registry document. But as my gaze swept over the meticulously rendered lines of the estate, my hand froze. There, just to the west of the old standing stones, where the ancient oak grove stood sentinel, a new detail had emerged. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer, my eyes tracing the unfamiliar glyph. It resembled a twisted knot, or perhaps a stylized root system, converging on a single, unsettling point. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that I was seeing things, hallucinating. I rubbed my eyes, then looked again. The symbol remained, stark against the aged parchment. It seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light, drawing my gaze, holding it captive. My hand trembled, a tremor that spread through my entire body. This was not fatigue. This was not the old house settling. This was something else entirely. The map, my anchor to the tangible world, had betrayed me. It had changed. It was reaching out. It was awake. It was a place of sterile dread, where the light itself felt anesthetized, bleached of all warmth. I tried to move, to call out, but my limbs were lead, my throat a knot of ash. The quiet hum intensified, a low thrum that vibrated not just in my ears, but deep within my bones, a sound that promised an awakening into something far worse than this dream. Then, a sudden, jarring jolt. My eyes snapped open, a gasp tearing from my throat, raw and desperate. The rhythmic sighing was merely the wind groaning through a loose shutter, the whirring a distant memory of the old grandfather clock downstairs. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped within a cage of bone. The phantom metallic tang lingered, a bitter aftertaste on my tongue. The dream, or whatever spectral fragment it had been, had left its residue, a film of unease clinging to my skin. Sleep offered no solace, only a deeper plunge into the unnerving currents of this place. The map, with its unsettling blanks and cryptic symbols, lay spread on my desk, a silent accusation. My fingers, still trembling from the dream's grip, traced the familiar contours of the estate's grounds, the lines that promised both revelation and ruin. The time for hesitant exploration was over. The estate was no longer a puzzle to be solved, but a living, breathing enigma that threatened to consume me. I descended to the estate's small, forgotten library, a room I had only superficially explored. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through the grime-streaked windows, illuminating shelves heavy with generations of forgotten thoughts. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper, leather, and something else, a faint, earthy aroma, like disturbed soil. My fingers brushed against brittle spines, seeking not the grand tomes of history, but the unassuming, the overlooked. After hours of methodical searching, my fingers, gritty with the fine powder of decay, snagged on a collection of leather-bound journals tucked away behind a row of ancient legal texts. Their covers were cracked, the pages within a delicate parchment, the ink faded to shades of sepia and rust. The first, dating back nearly 2 centuries, belonged to an ancestor, a woman whose elegant script belied the growing frenzy of her entries. Her early observations were mundane, detailing harvests and social calls. But then, a shift. The Land Speaks, an entry from 1837 read, the letters sprawling, ink bleeding. It demands a tithe. The well runs dry, but the earth below, it thirsts for more than water. My gaze darted to my map, to the faint, almost imperceptible circle I had marked near the ancient well on the estate's western edge. Further entries chronicled a descent. The children. They wander too close to the old oak. They hear its call. They are drawn. My mind immediately conjured the gnarled, ancient oak, a landmark I had noted on my map, a prominent feature near the boundary line. The woman's final entries were barely legible, a chaotic jumble of symbols and desperate pleas. I moved to the next journal, then the next, a grim procession through the minds of my lineage. Among the journals, I found a bundle of letters, tied with a brittle, faded ribbon. They were correspondence between a previous estate owner and a distant relative, dated from the early 1900s. The relative, writing from afar, expressed concern. I hear of the disappearances, the strange lights, one letter read. Is it true that the groundskeeper's boy vanished near the old mill? Be wary of the old ways, and especially of the maps. They were never meant to be completed. The name, Reid. The letters were addressed to my great-great-grandfather, also named Reid. The weight of lineage settled upon me, a suffocating shroud woven from madness and unanswered questions. It wasn't just a guide to hidden features, it was a blueprint for an ancient, malevolent force. The blank spaces weren't empty, they were silent, hungry places. A sudden, sharp rap echoed from the floor above, a sound like a heavy book falling. The house was settling, I told myself, a familiar creak of old timber. But the sound had been too distinct, too deliberate. The air in the library, already heavy, seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. It knew I was close. The map, in my trembling hands, felt less like an object of discovery and more like an invitation to my own undoing. The revelation of my name, echoing back through generations, had settled within me not as a curiosity, but as a chilling premonition. It was a cold knot, tightening with each passing hour, pulling at the threads of my sanity. My meticulous nature, usually a source of comfort, had become a torment, each detail on the incomplete map a potential key to a lock I was terrified to open. The subtle shifts began to sharpen, losing their ghostly ambiguity. They slithered from the corners of rooms, pulsed from beneath floorboards, and rustled in the dry leaves outside the windows. At first, they were fragmented, disjointed phrases. The blood. Beneath. Claim. But then, with an insidious clarity, they began to form full sentences. Raising gooseflesh on my arms. Your lineage, Reid, is bound to this earth. Another time, as I traced the faded lines of the map, a guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, directly beneath my feet. The sacrifice is long overdue. The words were not just heard, they were felt. Vibrating through my bones, shaking the very foundation of my reason. Then came the physical manifestations, undeniable and aggressive. A heavy tome, left open on the reading table, suddenly slammed shut with a concussive force that rattled the window panes. Keys, placed carefully on the hall console, would vanish, only to reappear later, scattered across the floor of the study. One afternoon, a porcelain bust of an unknown ancestor, perched on a high shelf, toppled without warning, shattering into 1,000 fragments, each shard a tiny, mocking eye. One night, exhausted but terrified to sleep, I drifted into a waking nightmare. I was no longer in the decaying comfort of the estate, but in a long, low-ceilinged passage. A low, rhythmic hiss and sigh echoed, like some vast, unseen mechanism drawing breath, a sound both mechanical and unnervingly organic. The walls, slick with condensation, reflected the sparse, weak glow from distant, flickering utility lights. There was no one else, no shadow of a living soul, only the endless, sterile stretch of the passage, a forgotten artery beneath the earth. The rhythmic exhalations of the machinery pulsed around me, a silent conversation in a language I didn't understand, yet its intent felt profoundly sinister. He waits. Your blood is his key. And then, ahead of me, where the flickering lights barely pierced the gloom, a form began to coalesce. It was not fully opaque, more a distortion of the air itself, a shimmering heat haze given malevolent intelligence. It was tall, impossibly thin, its outline wavering like smoke. Its head was indistinct, but I felt the weight of its gaze, a crushing pressure that stole my breath. Find the heart. I needed to escape, to tell someone. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling as I dialed the number of a distant colleague, an academic I trusted. The line rang once, twice, then clicked dead. I tried again. Nothing. The signal was gone. A profound, terrifying isolation settled upon me. The estate, which I had once seen as a legacy, was now a prison. The outside world had vanished, severed by an unseen hand. It was demanding. And it was waiting. The incomplete map lay spread beneath the flickering gaslight in the study, its parchment brittle, its inks faded to sepia and rust. Dust motes danced in the anemic glow, mimicking the frantic swirl of thoughts in my skull. Days had blurred into a single, endless vigil. My fingers, stained with ancient pigments and the grime of the estate's forgotten corners, traced the anomalous symbols I had painstakingly uncovered beneath layers of plaster and within the brittle bindings of ancestral texts. These were not the usual cartographic notations, nor were they the cryptic embellishments of a bygone era. The last piece, a small, oddly shaped fragment I'd found tucked inside the spine of a leather-bound chronicle of local geological surveys, clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. It was not a physical click, but a sudden, violent reordering of my understanding. The fragment depicted a series of concentric circles, etched with a precision that belied the crudeness of the surrounding lines, terminating at a central, aberrant symbol, a jagged, gaping maw. Around this, the strange characters I had been collecting began to coalesce, forming a coherent, terrible narrative. It was not a map of buried treasure, no vein of gold or cache of jewels. It was a diagram of containment. A seal. A prison. My breath hitched, ragged and thin in the silent room. The estate, this land, was not merely built over something. It was the something. The lines, the contours of the terrain I had so carefully mapped, were not just physical features, they were the chains, the wards, the intricate geometry of an ancient binding. And the center, that jagged maw, was not a landmark, but the point of its deepest interment, the very heart of its confinement. It spoke of generations of guardians, of rituals performed beneath specific phases of the moon, of the meticulous maintenance of the seal. It warned of erosion, of neglect, of the slow, inexorable weakening of the prison walls. My own family name, Reid, was woven into these passages, not as an owner, but as a keeper. A bloodline tasked with vigilance. A profound, sickening realization washed over me. I had been drawn here, not by chance, but by an unseen current, a generational pull. I was either meant to reinforce the failing wards, to complete the ancient design, or, God help me, to inadvertently shatter them, to release the very thing my ancestors had dedicated their lives to containing. A tremor ran through the floorboards, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The gaslight flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary gloom before flaring back to life. A low groan, deep and resonant, vibrated through the stone walls, not a sound of the old house settling, but of something immense stirring beneath. It was the sound of colossal weight shifting, of ancient bonds groaning under strain. I clutched at the map, my knuckles white, my gaze fixed on the central symbol, the gaping maw. It seemed to pulse, to breathe, in the wavering light. My mind, already stretched taut, threatened to snap. The weight of this knowledge, this terrible inheritance, pressed down on me, crushing the last vestiges of my composure. The room began to swim. The contours of the map warped, the lines blurring, stretching into impossible dimensions. The walls around me seemed to recede, the sturdy oak replaced by bland, pale surfaces. The gaslight guttered and died, replaced by a harsh, fluorescent glow that hummed with a low, mechanical drone. I was no longer in the study. The air, though sterile, carried a faint, unsettling odor of sickness and decay. White walls stretched endlessly, punctuated by closed doors. I felt a fleeting, desperate urge to run, to scream, but my throat was tight, my limbs frozen. This was not real. It could not be real. Then, with a shudder that felt like my soul being ripped from my body, the vision dissolved. The sterile walls evaporated, the mechanical breathing faded. I was back in the study, gasping, sweat beading on my forehead, the map still clutched in my trembling hands. The scent of damp earth and ozone still clung to the air. The seal was weakening. The entity was stirring. The path ahead was no longer about discovery, but survival. Or perhaps, something far worse, complicity. The cold knot in my gut had tightened into a leaden anchor, dragging me deeper into the murky waters of dread. The estate, once a haven of dusty history and quiet contemplation, now pulsed with a malevolent heartbeat, each thrum echoing the unraveling of my own composure. Sleep offered no escape, only a porous veil through which the entity's whispers seeped, distorting the very fabric of my waking hours. Exhaustion knotted me, stripping away the layers of meticulous logic I had so carefully constructed over a lifetime. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of old sterility and something else, something cloying and ancient, like earth disturbed from a long slumber. The rhythmic hiss and sigh of unseen ventilators, the software of monitors, created a symphony of clinical detachment, yet beneath it, I felt a vibration, a low hum that resonated deep within my own bones. My feet, heavy and unresponsive, carried me forward. The linoleum beneath my worn boots felt slick, almost yielding. I peered into one, seeing only the ghostly outlines of abandoned equipment, draped in shrouds of dust like forgotten patience. Then, a thought, not my own, unfolded in the cavern of my mind, clear as a bell, yet utterly alien. "You are close, Reid." It was a presence, vast and ancient, now pressing against the thin membrane of myself. The hallway seemed to stretch interminably, the rhythmic breathing of the machines growing louder, more insistent, mirroring the frantic pulse now hammering in my temples. "The legacy is yours. Embrace it." A vision flashed before my inner eye, the incomplete map, its lines writhing, extending, completing themselves in a furious, inky sprawl. "Foolish mortal. You inherited this burden. You are bound by blood." Suddenly, the air grew heavy, thick with a palpable pressure. The machine's breathing became ragged, gasping. It was like an icy hand reaching into my chest, seeking to grasp my very soul. "Let go, Reid. Join me." It was a faint, almost forgotten memory, a dusty page from one of the estate's oldest, most obscure ledgers, a book I'd dismissed as mere property records. But now, lines of archaic script shimmered into clarity, not in the hallucinatory hallway, but in the forefront of my mind. A ritual. A severance. Not an unearthing, but a resealing. The words were fragmented, cryptic, yet their meaning coalesced with terrifying clarity. It spoke of a bond, forged in blood and earth, that could only be broken by an act of absolute rejection. I had to disown the ancestral claim, not just verbally, but in spirit, in deed, and perhaps, irrevocably. It meant abandoning my very identity, my connection to the past, to the generations of cartographers and landowners who had come before me. It implied a sacrifice of my future, ensuring no further lineage would carry this burden, this stain. The cost was immense, a tearing away of the very roots of my existence, the destruction of the historical legacy I had sought to understand and preserve. It was a choice between becoming a vessel for this ancient malevolence or becoming nothing, a ghost without a past or a future, a broken link in a chain that had stretched back for centuries. The entity recoiled slightly, its pervasive presence flickering as if struck. It had read my thoughts, understood the dawning horror and the impossible resolve. "You would destroy yourself, for what? This land will consume you regardless." But the knowledge was now mine, a desperate, terrifying truth. The fate of the land, of all that lay beyond its cursed borders, hung on this impossible choice. The game was no longer about discovery, it was about survival, and the price was my very soul. The sterile air, sharp with disinfectant, and the quiet hum of unseen machines, thinned around me. The white walls, once so starkly defined, softened at their edges, blurring into an indistinct gray. The steady beep 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 of a monitor, a rhythm that had anchored me, began to stretch, warp, until it was a guttural thrum, then a silence that pressed against my ears. The faint light above flickered, not a fluorescent tube but a dying ember, then vanished, plunging me into a profound, earthy dark. My fingers, still tingling from the phantom touch of cold steel, now brushed against rough, cold stone. This was it. The precipice. The map's final, blank space, now yawning before me. The truth, stark and terrible, had rooted itself in my mind. There was no escape, only this descent. The entity demanded its due, and I, Reid, its unwitting inheritor, was the one to pay. Before me, the earth opened, a jagged tear in the hillside I had spent weeks trying to locate. This was no natural cave, I knew, but a passage deliberately carved, then forgotten, until my lineage had stirred its slumbering malevolence. The first step was into a suffocating quiet. The descent was steep, the rough-hewn steps slick with moisture and something slimy that clung to my boots. Each echo of my footsteps seemed to stretch, distort, becoming not my own, but a chorus of phantom shuffles and scrapes, as if an unseen procession mirrored my every move. Turn back, Reid. It isn't too late. The thought was not mine, yet it bloomed in my mind with perfect clarity, a tendril of insidious comfort. My grip tightened on the lantern. No. That life was a lie, a fragile illusion built on a rotting foundation. Water wept from unseen fissures, pattering onto the floor, a monotonous, maddening rhythm. Not words, not yet, but a sibilant hiss, a rustle of dry leaves, just at the edge of hearing, always behind me, just out of sight. The path ahead seemed to twist and contort, the ground beneath my feet growing uneven, treacherous. You can't save them. You can only join them. This thought was sharper, edged with a terrible certainty. My breath hitched. I pushed it away, focusing on the beam of my lantern, on the next precarious step. The passage opened into a larger chamber, vast and echoing. My light was swallowed by its immensity, barely illuminating the slick, uneven floor and the dripping stalactites above. And then I saw it. On the far wall, barely catching the edge of my lantern's glow, was not natural rock, but something worked. A massive, intricate carving, partially obscured by centuries of mineral deposits and clinging moss. I approached, my boots squelching in a shallow pool of viscous liquid that pooled on the floor. As I drew closer, the details emerged from the gloom. It was a map, not of the surface, but of the underworld. And at the heart of that maw, a single, recurring symbol, a coiled serpent devouring its own tail, etched with horrifying precision. But this was no mere symbol of eternity. The serpent's scales were not smooth, but depicted as a myriad of tiny, contorted faces, each one screaming in silent, eternal torment. And the coiled serpent, the devourer, was the entity itself. The map on the wall, so ancient, so utterly alien, was the true blueprint, the final piece of the puzzle. It revealed not just the path, but the nature of the thing I faced, and the terrible, ancient purpose of the ritual I was bound to complete. The central maw, the serpent's heart, was where I needed to go. The descent was far from over. Untimely, until the sound itself unspooled into a thin, shimmering thread, then vanished. The world, or what I had understood of it, had peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing a stark, unsettling truth beneath. The air, once sterile and sharp, now tasted of dust and something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. The quiet hum of unseen machines persisted, but it was no longer a reassuring drone. It was a rhythmic, almost predatory gasp, each inhalation a slow, deliberate pull, each exhalation a long, sibilant sigh that seemed to drain the very light from the fluorescent tubes above. These tubes flickered, not with a mechanical fault, but with an intentional, malevolent rhythm, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like skeletal figures along the peeling linoleum. Where were the white walls? They were here, yes, but stained with a pervasive, yellowish grime that seeped from the ceiling, weeping down to meet the scuffed floor. The doors lining the corridor, uniform and bland, were not merely closed, they were sealed, like tombs, their handles tarnished, their surfaces scarred with scratches that looked less like wear and more like frantic claw marks. My own body felt distant, a fragile vessel tethered by a thread to this desolate scene. This was not the estate. Yet, it was all of it. The entity had twisted my perception, dragged me into a landscape of its own making, a purgatorial space where the mundane was rendered monstrous. Fear was a luxury I could not afford. My fingers, phantom limbs, curled as if grasping the rolled parchment of the incomplete map. I closed my eyes, seeking the familiar lines, the precise angles, the symbols that had haunted my waking hours. The memory of the map, every intricate detail etched into my mind, was my only compass, my only weapon. The hallway began to shift. The floor beneath my feet rippled like dark water. The walls bowed inward, pressing close, their grimy surfaces seeming to weep. The machine's breathing grew frantic, a desperate panting, and the air thickened, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and acrid, like burnt offerings. The entity was testing me, trying to break my focus, to dissolve my will in this corrosive environment. I focused on the map. Not the physical object, but the idea of it. The estate, I realized, was not just a place, but a complex diagram of energies, of boundaries and intersections. The entity thrived in the disruption of these lines, in the blurring of what was meant to be separate. My task was to redraw those lines, to assert the order the map represented. I opened my eyes. I imagined the estate's hidden ley lines, the ancient paths of power, superimposed onto this warped space. The central crypt, the nexus of its corruption, was not beneath the old chapel, but here, in the very heart of this desolate corridor. Your blood is mine. But the map, the true map, held the key not just to its history, but to its undoing. The final, incomplete symbol, the one I had struggled to decipher, now burned in my mind with terrible clarity. It was a sigil of binding, a knot in the fabric of reality, designed to contain what could not be destroyed. It required not blood, but a conscious act of will, a reassertion of order over chaos. My gaze fixed on the focal point in the hallway. I began to move, my steps slow, deliberate, each one a stroke of an invisible pen. I traced the perimeter of the hallway, not physically, but mentally, drawing the lines of the estate's original boundaries, the protective wards my ancestors had attempted to lay. The air crackled around me. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated in my bones, trying to tear my concentration. I reached the central point, the place where the entity's power was most concentrated. I raised my hand, not to strike, but to draw. I poured my will into it, my knowledge, my lineage, not as a sacrifice, but as a defiant assertion of control. A blinding flash, not of light, but of pure, white negation, erupted from the symbol. The soundless shriek of the entity intensified, then fractured, splintering into 1,000 dying echoes. The pressure in my skull eased, replaced by a searing pain, as if my mind had been flayed. The grimy walls, the scuffed floor, the flickering lights, everything shuddered, then snapped back into a semblance of its former desolation. The machines continued their quiet breathing, but now it sounded weary, defeated. The entity was gone, banished, contained. The entity was contained, yes, but not destroyed. And in the act of binding it, in completing that final, ancient sigil, I had not merely drawn a line on a map. My lineage, my knowledge, my very essence, was now intertwined with its containment. I was free, but irrevocably bound. The battle was over, but the war within me had just begun. The me that was, a meticulous cartographer of known lands, had been erased. What remained was a ghost, an echo in a hollowed-out shell, adrift in a profound, echoing silence. The last vestige of that terrible, consuming presence had receded, not with a roar, but with a sigh like the wind through shattered glass. A silence so absolute it pressed against my eardrums, threatening to crack them. Each shallow inhalation felt like a betrayal, a continuation of a life that should have ended with the thing beneath the earth. I don't recall the passage of time, nor the means of my transition. The air hung stagnant, tasting faintly of ozone in disuse, not the sterile tang I might have expected. The machines, unseen behind closed doors, hummed a low, persistent thrum, a mechanical heartbeat in the pervasive stillness. Each breath they took was slow, measured, and utterly indifferent to my existence. My vision, when it finally sharpened, registered the peeling paint on the walls, the scuff marks on the linoleum floor. Dust motes, visible in the anemic light, drifted like tiny, lost souls. Not scars from a battle, not cuts, but something deeper, more insidious. They were like the fissures on a parched riverbed, or the intricate etchings on an old map, yet they pulsed with a faint, internal heat. My fingers, once so steady, trembled. The entity was gone. I knew this with an unnerving certainty that went beyond mere knowing. It was an absence felt in the very marrow of my bones, a negative space where an immense, suffocating weight had been. A residue. A fragment. My muscles screamed, a dull, persistent ache that was a distant cousin to the sharp, visceral pains that had once defined my every moment. My face was gaunt, my eyes sunken, but it was not merely exhaustion. There was a depth in their gaze now, a terrible understanding that had not been there before. The meticulous cartographer, who once charted the known world, now bore the indelible marks of a landscape beyond human comprehension. My hair, once neatly trimmed, was a wild tangle of white and gray, as if years had been stolen from me in a single, terrifying night. No footsteps, no distant voices, no clatter of carts. Only the quiet, rhythmic exhalations of the machines behind the doors. They were the only witnesses to my shattered reality. I was alone, utterly and profoundly alone, in a place that felt both temporary and eternal. My mind, once a fortress of logic and order, was now a shattered mosaic. It had consumed, and in turn, it had been satisfied. Or perhaps, merely sated. The estate, my ancestral home, was a ruin. I saw it in my mind's eye, foundations rent, timbers splintered, the land itself scarred and violated, a gaping wound beneath the indifferent sky. The world, oblivious in its turning, would never know the horror that had unfolded there, nor the price that had been paid. I ran my tongue over my teeth. They felt different, sharper, though I knew it was only a trick of my traumatized senses. The fragment, the residue, was not a physical presence, but a shift in my internal cartography. My perception had been altered. The world no longer seemed quite so solid, so predictable. I saw the hidden currents, the subtle shifts in the air, the faint, shimmering lines that connected all things, a terrifyingly intricate web of energy and decay. It was knowledge, yes, but knowledge that tasted of ash and despair, a wisdom bought at the cost of my sanity. I was no longer merely a man. My eyes fluttered open to a muted world, a canvas of pale, institutional beige. I was lying on something soft, yet strangely unyielding, the texture of thin, starched cotton against my skin. Above me, a ceiling of acoustic tiles stretched, punctuated by the dull, recessed glow of fluorescent lights. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a distant drumbeat against the silence that now filled my skull. Then, a sound. The air hung heavy with a scent I couldn't quite place, sterile, yet with an underlying metallic tang, like old pennies in ozone. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. This was my hand, yet it felt alien, disconnected from the core of my being. My gaze drifted to the window at the end of the hallway, a rectangle of pale gray light that promised nothing but more desolation. How long had I been here? Days? Weeks? The concept of time had become a fluid, meaningless thing, a river whose currents I no longer navigated. Memories flickered, shards of a broken mirror. Oh, the sacrifice. The memory of it was a searing brand on my soul, a price paid in a currency far more precious than blood. It was the price of me. The meticulous cartographer, the man who charted the known, who sought order in the chaos of lines and contours, was gone. He had been offered up, a willing, or perhaps unwilling, offering to quell the hunger that stirred beneath the ancient stones. It wasn't pain, not exactly. Now, a new self, or what was left of it, inhabited this shell. I felt lighter, somehow. Unburdened, yet also untethered. The world outside the window, the world beyond this hallway, felt distant, unreal. Had I truly escaped? Or had the entity merely released its grip, satisfied with its meal, leaving me to wander its periphery, a living monument to its power? The quiet breathing of the machines continued, an insistent, rhythmic thrum against the backdrop of my racing thoughts. I wasn't alone. Not truly. The presence, that vast, ancient hunger, had receded, yes. But it hadn't vanished. It was a deep hum beneath the surface of the world, a constant, low thrumming that only I could now perceive. It was in the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the floor beneath me, a resonance from something vast and slumbering far below. It was in the taste of the air, metallic and earthy, a taste that had seeped into my very bones. I pushed myself up, slowly, painfully, until I was sitting on the edge of the cot. My legs swung weakly, my bare feet touching the cool, linoleum floor. I knew what lay beneath the estate. I knew the power it wielded, the appetite it possessed. And I knew the terrible cost of its appeasement. I had survived, yes, but at what cost? My old life, my old self, was irrevocably lost. The lines of the map I had once meticulously drawn now seemed childish, naive. I had stumbled upon a truth so profound and terrible that it had reshaped my very being. The estate, the land, the thing beneath it, they were a part of me now. A permanent fixture in the landscape of my soul. I was no longer merely a cartographer, I was a guardian, a keeper of a terrible secret. Or perhaps, something more insidious. The thought slid into my mind, smooth as polished stone, and settled there. What if the entity, in consuming my old self, had subtly reshaped me? My purpose, my drive, my very will, were they truly my own anymore? I pressed my palm against the cool glass, looking out at a world that seemed both familiar and terrifyingly new. The horror was contained, yes. The immediate threat had receded. But it was not over. It would never be over. My new beginning was merely a different kind of ending, an eternity of vigilance, or perhaps, an eternity of subtle servitude. The map was complete, but the journey had just begun. And I, Reid, was no longer the one holding the compass,